About 8 years ago, I went on a long solo road trip across the US. I'd left southern Ontario with just a rough plan in my head. Go down the eastern seaboard, spend some time meandering through the southern states, then make my way west toward California. No real itinerary, no hard deadlines. I had my camping gear in the trunk, a decent amount of money saved up, and enough experience with backcountry camping and hiking to feel confident I could handle whatever came my way. I had done dozens of solo trips across Canadian forest trails, camped in heavy rains, slept through windstorms, dealt with bugs and cold and the occasional wildlife sighting. I knew how to stay calm, how to move efficiently, how to read the signs around me, or at least I thought I did. When I got to Utah, I hadn't planned to stop in Bryce Canyon, but I saw the name on the map and thought it would be worth a detour. I'd never hiked in a desert-like environment before, and the pictures of the rock formations, those red hoodoos and cliffs, looked too beautiful to skip. It was late September, and the weather had been dry and mild the whole way. The sun was still strong in the sky, but the nights were starting to cool off. I got to the Bryce Canyon area late in the afternoon, parked near one of the more remote trailheads, packed my bag with enough gear for an overnight hike, and set off on foot down into the canyon. I remember the smell of the dry earth and the way the dust kicked up with every step. It wasn't like hiking in the forests back home. No pine needles underfoot, no shade from tall trees, no moist air. The ground was sandy, and the rock formations towered over me like walls. I was surrounded by stone on all sides, smooth and jagged, shaped by wind and time. I followed a narrow trail that wound down through the canyon. The further I descended, the quieter it got. No wind, no bird calls, just the crunch of my boots and the occasional shifting of loose gravel. I walked for a few hours, taking pictures, watching the way the light changed as the sun dipped lower. I found a spot near the bottom of the canyon with a bit of flat ground nestled between two walls of rock and decided to set up camp there for the night. It wasn't an official site, but it was out of the way and had enough shelter from the wind. I pitched my tent, made a quick meal from a dehydrated pack, and stretched out to rest. The sky was still mostly clear, with only a few wispy clouds overhead. I remember thinking how wide and open the sky looked without trees. I fell asleep early, with the canyon walls glowing a soft orange from the last of the sunlight. I woke up just before sunrise. It was still cool and quiet. I made coffee and sat near a small ledge, sipping slowly, watching the light climb down the rock faces. I planned to hike further along the canyon floor for a few hours before looping back out a different trail and reaching the car by early afternoon. I packed up my gear, strapped everything back into my pack, and started moving again. About 30 minutes into my hike, I noticed that the sky had started to shift. A few more clouds had rolled in, thicker now, darker, especially toward the north. I didn't think much of it at first. I'd been through enough passing showers and misty mornings to assume it would be brief. There was no forecast for rain when I had checked the day before, and in the dry desert, rain didn't feel like something to worry about. But then I started noticing the smell in the air. It was subtle, that kind of sharp, metallic tang that comes before a storm. I kept walking, but the wind started to pick up slightly. A few drops hit the back of my neck, cold and sudden. I stopped and looked around. The trail I was following was winding through a narrow channel in the rock, maybe 5 or 6 feet wide in some spots, deeper in others. The bottom was packed with fine sand, and I realized there were smooth lines along the walls, subtle curves and marks carved into the rock a few feet above my head. That was when it hit me. These weren't just marks from erosion. This was a wash, a dry riverbed, and now it was starting to rain. I didn't need to think twice. I turned around and started moving fast, retracing my steps back toward the path that had led down into the canyon. The rain was still light, but I knew that in terrain like this, water didn't soak into the ground. It ran, and when it ran fast. The higher elevations would collect that water and funnel it all down into these narrow spaces, places exactly like where I was walking. What had been dry for months could become a rushing river in minutes. I could already feel the ground beneath my boots getting slick. Not muddy, just wet enough to lose traction on the packed sand and stone. I moved as fast as I could, keeping my head down, counting my steps, focusing on my breathing. The trail started to climb, but it wasn't a straight path. It was switchbacks and scrambles, loose rocks and slanted shelves. My boots kept sliding on the incline, and I had to drop to all fours a couple times to get better grip. Then I heard it. At first it sounded like wind or distant thunder, a low, steady rumble coming from somewhere behind me. I turned and looked down the slope. The bottom of the canyon was no longer dry. A thin ribbon of water was already forming. Within seconds it started to widen. It wasn't a trickle anymore. It was a stream, fast, gaining volume. I pushed harder. My legs were burning, my pack felt like it had doubled in weight, and my hands were scraped raw from grabbing at rough rock. But I didn't stop. Every few seconds I'd glance over my shoulder and see the water creeping higher, spreading out, bouncing off the canyon walls and swirling in places that had been bone dry only 10 minutes earlier. At one point I slipped and slid down about 6 feet, catching myself hard on my elbows. The edge of the trail was now slick like polished stone, and there wasn't much to grab. I used the heel of my boot to wedge into a crevice and pushed myself back up, heart pounding. My shirt was soaked with sweat and rain. The rumble behind me was louder now, not just a stream but something deeper, heavier. The air felt charged, like the sound was pushing ahead of the water. I finally crested the last big rise and scrambled up onto a wide ledge about 20 or 30 feet above the canyon floor. I turned around to look, and what I saw made my knees go weak. The entire bottom of the canyon was underwater. What had been a winding dry trail was now a churning, muddy river, thick with debris, branches, rocks, even the remains of a fallen log that looked like it had been dry rotting for years. The water was moving fast, too fast for anyone to walk through. If I had hesitated even a minute longer, I'm not sure I would have made it out. That last slope had been barely climbable even when it was dry. I sat down on the ledge, breathing hard, watching the water rush by. I didn't feel scared anymore, just stunned. I had camped just a little further down that wash, not even 12 hours earlier. If that rain had come overnight, I wouldn't be sitting here. After the floodwater started to slow, I took my time hiking out. I was soaked, my legs were shaking, and I had new cuts and bruises I hadn't noticed in the rush. But I was out. I didn't take any more chances that trip. That night, I found a proper campsite outside the park, cooked a hot meal, and went to bed early. The only other time I felt that kind of fear was back home in Ontario, a few years before that trip. I was hiking a trail in Algonquin late in the season, just a quick 2-night trip before the snow started. The forest was quiet, most of the leaves already down, and I hadn't seen another person all day. I was rounding a bend when 2 bear cubs came trotting out of the bush and walked right across the trail maybe 6 feet in front of me. Tiny little things, wobbling and fearless. They didn't even look at me. My heart stopped. I froze, didn't breathe, didn't move. The only thought in my head was, where is the mother? I scanned the trees, every shadow, every flicker of movement, but I didn't see her. I turned and walked backward down the trail for a good 50 yards before I even dared to turn around and walk normally. Never saw her, but I didn't stick around. Both of those moments, very different places, very different dangers, but the same lesson. Nature doesn't care how experienced you think you are. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. If you don't pay attention, if you ignore the signs, it will teach you fast and without mercy. I was lucky. I walked away both times, but I stopped calling myself prepared after that. Now I just say I'm careful, and I don't underestimate anything anymore. Back in late September of 2021, my husband and I took a trip we'd been planning for years. We had finally secured permits to backpack the Teton Crest Trail in Wyoming, and we aimed to hit it late in the season when the crowds would be thinner. The plan was to move slowly, camp high, and enjoy the quiet before winter came. We weren't strangers to backpacking or rough weather. We'd done alpine routes before, but this trip had a way of stacking one terrifying moment after another. Even now, thinking back on it makes my heart beat faster. We started the trip with decent weather. It was warm, hot actually, for September at elevation. Dry summer, no recent storms, blue skies. We were careful about our water since some of the creeks and seasonal streams we'd counted on were completely dried up. That first couple of days, we sweated constantly. It was probably hovering around 90 degrees during the day, and the sun felt like it was hammering directly on us. Shade was rare above tree line, and even when we ducked behind boulders to rest, the rocks radiated heat. We were making our way toward a high pass, above 10,000 feet, when my husband started getting nervous about a cluster of clouds building in the distance. Nothing major yet, but we'd both seen fast-developing storms roll in during past trips. Lightning at high elevation is no joke. He got anxious and started pushing the pace, especially since we were moving above treeline with no cover in sight. His pack was loaded down more than mine. We had split our gear unevenly since I had an ankle injury a few months before, and he didn't want to risk me carrying too much. But the heat was brutal, and he'd already been sweating buckets. By the time we were halfway up the climb, he'd burned through all of his water. We checked our topo map and saw there were a few blue lines, streams, crossing the trail not far ahead. Maybe a mile. We figured it was worth pushing to one of those. But the first stream bed was completely dry. Just a cracked line of dust with a few scattered pebbles. We moved on. The second looked better, narrower and deeper, but still bone dry. We kept moving, and that's when I noticed he was starting to slow down fast. He wasn't talking, just trudging. His steps looked off, kind of unsteady, like his feet were too heavy. He was weaving a little, and when we stopped so he could sit on a flat rock, I saw he was pale and breathing a little too hard. He admitted he felt dizzy and nauseous, and his lips looked dry and cracked. I still had water left, but not much. We were trying to save what we had in case the next stream was dry too. There was one more stream ahead on the map, maybe 3/4 of a mile. It looked a little more promising, wider, deeper, and it fed into a small tarn just off trail. I told him to stay put with our stuff and I'd go ahead, get water, and come back. It was slow moving with a loaded pack, and I knew I could make better time on my own. He didn't argue. He just laid back with his pack under his head and told me he'd rest. I started hiking fast, trying not to trip on loose rocks or roots. I passed more dry trickles of creeks, the heat making everything feel warped and sluggish. But after maybe 20 minutes, I heard something, actual water. A faint trickling sound. I followed the noise off trail a bit and found the stream. It was flowing, narrow, shallow, but moving. The water was cold and clear, cutting a thin line through bright green moss. I knelt down by the edge and pulled out the filter from my hip pouch. I was just about to start pumping when I heard a rustling noise across the stream. It was subtle at first, like something brushing through bushes or tall grass. I froze. My first thought was another hiker, but we hadn't seen a single person for hours. I scanned the other side of the stream. It was dense with willow and scrubby pine, nothing too tall, but enough to block a clear view. Then I saw it, a small, round brown head. A bear cub, then another and another. All 3 cubs were clambering through the brush maybe 20 feet from me, playful but alert. My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen the mother yet, but I knew she had to be close. I stood up slowly and scanned harder. Then I saw her, just behind the cubs, big, heavy, broad-shouldered, and staring directly at me. She didn't charge. She didn't make any aggressive moves, but she was watching me with sharp, quiet focus. I backed up slowly, water forgotten, and started talking out loud. Not yelling, just firm, even noise, trying to make it clear I was a human and I wasn't there to bother her. My heart was hammering. I kept one eye on her the whole time and moved up the bank, giving her space. She didn't follow. She watched. I moved until the brush and terrain blocked her from view, then turned and moved fast. I ended up taking a wide loop around and coming back to the stream 100 yards upstream where it was more open and exposed. No sign of the bear or the cubs. I filtered water fast, shaking the whole time, then booked it back to my husband. He was half asleep when I got there. I handed him water first before saying anything. Then I sat down and just stared at the ground for a while, trying to calm down. He asked me if I was okay and I nodded. Eventually I told him. The color drained from his face. We didn't say much else for the rest of the afternoon. That night we camped up on Death Canyon Shelf. It was a big open stretch of alpine tundra with dramatic cliffs and a wide view of the valley. The weather had turned during our climb. The wind picked up and thick gray clouds started stacking in from the west. By the time we got the tent up, it was cold, and we could smell rain coming. We ate fast and ducked inside the tent before dark. Then the thunder started. First, it was far off, a low rumble every few minutes. But soon it was constant. Lightning cracked so close I could feel the vibrations through the ground, and the air started to smell sharp and chemical, like metal, like ozone. The sound wasn't just above us. It was around us, echoing off the cliffs in every direction. It felt like the storm had collapsed right on top of us. We crouched low inside the tent, trying not to touch the poles or anything metal. Our pads kept us off the ground as best they could, but it felt completely pointless. There was nowhere to go. No trees, no cover. We were the highest point for a mile in every direction. Every flash of lightning lit up the entire tent like daylight, and the thunder cracked a half second later, over and over. I had never felt so small. Then we noticed it was bright outside, brighter than it should have been. At first, I thought maybe something was on fire, a forest fire, maybe, but when we unzipped the vestibule, we saw white. Everything was white, for inches of snow had dumped in less than half an hour. Wet, heavy snow. In early fall, the ground was steaming with heat meeting cold. It was still lightning, still thundering, and now everything was soaked and frozen. We didn't sleep much, just crouched low and waited it out, shivering, listening to the tent walls flap and snap in the wind. The next morning was calm, perfectly clear. Blue sky, sun rising over the peaks. Everything sparkled with frost and melt. It looked beautiful, almost surreal, but our tent had collapsed halfway under the weight of snow, and most of our gear was damp. We packed up slowly and headed down the shelf, careful of ice patches, scanning constantly for more storms, more bears. On the last night, we got caught in another hailstorm. Pea-sized hail hammering down so hard it stung through our jackets. That night, temperatures dropped again. Our sleeping bags barely kept up. When we woke up, there was frost in our water bottles and my toes felt numb for the first mile of hiking. That trip was hands down the most incredible experience I've ever had in the backcountry. But it was also the most terrifying. Every day brought something new to worry about. Bears, dehydration, storms, cold, lightning. None of it was dramatic or supernatural, just nature doing what it does. It reminded me how fast things can turn out there, how small you really are, and how thin the line is between awe and fear. Even now, years later, when I think about that brown head rising above the brush or the thunder rolling across Death Canyon, I feel it in my chest. That trip gave me more beautiful moments than I can count, but I've never forgotten the scary ones. I was 16 the summer we went camping in southern Utah. Not the touristy areas, not near Zion or Bryce or anything like that. We were way out past the paved roads, far from cell service, somewhere near where my grandfather had grown up decades earlier. My parents were both in their 50s then, and this was something they did once or twice a year. Drive out to the middle of nowhere, set up a tent, and spend a few nights disconnected from everything. I didn't exactly love it, but I didn't hate it either. There was a weird peace in how empty the land felt out there. We pulled in sometime late afternoon. The road had turned to dirt for miles before we reached the spot my dad had picked. There weren't even signs anymore. It was just flat desert broken by cliffs and dry riverbeds. Scrubby trees dotted the land. Nothing tall, just pinyon pines and junipers. The campsite wasn't official, just a flat patch of dirt by a fire ring someone else had left behind. We hadn't seen another vehicle for maybe an hour before we got there. We ate a simple dinner, hot dogs over the fire, a can of baked beans, a couple of apples. We had s'mores too. It was still warm even after the sun went down, but the kind of warm that felt like it wouldn't last. I remember sitting in my camp chair watching the fire die down and thinking how quiet it got out there. Not just quiet, but empty. You could hear the air moving, the insects, even your own breathing. No cars, no planes overhead, just nothing. After we cleaned up, we zipped ourselves into the big canvas tent we used back then. It had enough space for 3 cots and our bags. The fire was mostly out. There were still a few coals glowing, but nothing that gave off light or heat. I was lying on my back with my eyes open when I first heard the sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, a kind of low, steady noise like something rubbing against something else. But then it shifted, got sharper. I held my breath and listened. It wasn't the wind. It sounded like something moving in the brush. It was deliberate, too, not skittering like a rabbit or rustling like a bird. Heavy steps, slow and steady, in a circle. You could hear the crunch of dry twigs, the scrape of claws on hard ground. The animal wasn't walking toward us. It was walking around us, around the tent. I didn't move. I didn't even turn my head. Just stared at the ceiling of the tent and tried to keep breathing quietly. The noise circled again and again. Then I heard it, the low, unmistakable sound of a growl. Not a loud one, not even meant to scare. It sounded like something warning us, something angry. My stomach turned cold and I could feel my whole body start to shake even though I was trying so hard not to. It was a mountain lion. There was no mistaking it. I'd never heard one up close before, but I'd seen one at a wildlife demo years ago. They don't roar like people think. They growl low and deep, and sometimes they scream, like a woman being murdered. This one didn't scream, but it didn't need to. It was mad. I could hear it breathing. I could hear its weight as it moved past the side of the tent, then behind, then around again. At some point, I realized the breathing next to me had stopped. My parents were both awake. No one said anything. No one moved. We just listened to this animal stalk around us, waiting. I didn't know what it wanted. We had packed up all our food. There was nothing left out. The fire was out. We weren't making noise, and still it circled. Felt like forever. I don't know how long it really was. 10 minutes, 15, maybe more, but every second stretched out. I tried to focus on something else. My fingers, the sweat on my back, the sound of my pulse. But I always came back to the noise of that animal moving through the dirt, brushing against the edge of the tent, breathing. Then something happened. There was a sound outside, crack like a stick snapping, and then another, a whoosh. I saw the light flicker against the tent wall, orange and yellow, moving shadows. The fire was going again, not just a coal lighting up. It was a real fire. I could hear it now, too, the pop of sap in the wood, the flames licking at dry branches. It burned big enough that it cast shadows on the tent. I didn't understand it. None of us had moved. No one had added wood. Nothing should have restarted it. But it was burning again. Not out of control, just like it had earlier in the night. Then everything changed. The mountain lion growled one last time. Louder now. Then silence. I didn't hear it move away. I just knew it wasn't there anymore. It was like it vanished the second the fire came back to life. I waited, straining to hear even the smallest rustle. But nothing. The air was dead still. The only sound left was the fire. After a while, I finally breathed again. My legs were cramping from staying so still. My jaw hurt from clenching. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there listening to the fire, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. The fire burned steady, maybe for another hour, maybe more. Then it slowly died out again, just like before. In the morning, none of us said much. We stepped out of the tent and looked around. There were paw prints all around the campsite, big ones. You could see them in the dust circling the tent. There were a couple close to the fire pit. I walked over to it just to make sure I hadn't imagined it. The fire had burned clean right down to ash. No signs of anything weird. No lighter fluid. No matches left behind. No wind that could have stirred the coals. It was just as confusing in daylight as it had been in the dark. My dad looked at the pit for a long time and then just nodded, like he accepted it without needing an explanation. We packed up not long after. None of us said the word mountain lion. We didn't need to. We all knew. I kept glancing over my shoulder as we loaded the truck. The prints were already fading in the dry dirt. Back home, my grandma asked how the trip went. My mom told her about the mountain lion in a quiet voice, as if saying it too loud might make it real again. When she heard about the fire starting up, my grandma got this look in her eyes. She said something about my grandpa, that he used to camp out in that area when he was young, that he knew those hills better than anyone. She said he never would have let anything happen to us out there. I didn't say anything. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything like that. Still don't. But I don't know how that fire started. I don't know what made it come alive again just when we needed it. Maybe the wind blew just right. Maybe a spark buried deep in the ashes finally hit the right bit of kindling. Maybe we just got lucky. Whatever the reason, the fire came back when we needed it. That's all I know. And it was enough to send the mountain lion away. That's the part one still think about most. Not the fear, not the growling, not the circling. Just that quiet moment when the fire lit back up on its own. That was the moment we were safe. That was the moment everything changed. We never went back to that spot again. Not because we were scared, but because I think we knew that night was a one-time thing. Some things don't need repeating. Some places feel different after something like that. Like they've already shown you everything they have to offer. That was 25 years ago. I still go camping sometimes. Still sit by a fire and listen to the night. But I've never seen a fire do that again. Once was enough. Back in the summer of 2021, my husband and I took a camping trip to Boysen Reservoir in Wyoming. We'd been planning it for a while, just the two of us, trying to get away from everything. We live in the city, and the constant noise, crowds, and deadlines had worn us both thin. So we thought, what could be better than a quiet weekend near the water? Far from people? Wyoming seemed like the perfect spot. Open skies, untouched nature, and the kind of silence that most people don't realize they miss until they're surrounded by it. We managed to snag one of the beachfront campsites. At first glance, it felt like we'd won the lottery. The site opened right up to the reservoir, just a few feet of dry grass and then smooth stones leading down to the water. The view was unreal. Mountains off in the distance, clouds hanging low over the horizon, and water so still it looked like glass. But what we hadn't considered was how far we were from the other campsites. Ours was at the end of a long, narrow dirt road that twisted away from the main loop. There were no lights, no ranger station nearby, and no other people in sight. At the time, that felt like a blessing. We could drink, talk, relax, and not worry about anyone bothering us. We got there around mid-afternoon. The sun was high, and the temperature was hot but bearable with the wind coming off the water. We set up our tent close to the tree line where the ground was a little softer and started a fire in the pit provided. My husband unpacked the cooler while I unrolled our sleeping bags and organized our stuff in the tent. Once everything was in place, we sat on our camping chairs facing the water, just watching the ripples and listening to the breeze. It was exactly what we'd wanted. As the sun started to go down, everything around us changed. The warmth disappeared fast, and the shadows grew longer and darker. There weren't many birds around to begin with, but now even the few sounds we had gotten used to vanished. No rustling in the trees, no insects buzzing, nothing. It got so quiet it almost hurt my ears. We lit the fire and roasted hot dogs, had a few drinks, and watched the stars come out. They were incredible. More stars than I think I'd ever seen in my life. Wyoming's sky at night is like a whole other world. But along with that beauty came something else. A kind of stillness that made me feel like we weren't supposed to be there. It was probably around 9:30 when the weird part started. We were sitting close to the fire, not talking much, just enjoying the night, when we noticed headlights coming down the road. That caught our attention right away because no one else had come by since we'd arrived. The road was long and narrow and only led to our site. There was no through traffic. The car, a dark SUV with blacked out windows, slowly crept down toward us. It didn't stop when it reached our site. It kept going past our tent and fire and down to the edge of the beach. My husband stood up and waved at them, trying to be friendly, maybe thinking they were lost or looking for something. But the car didn't slow down or acknowledge him. It just drove down to the shore and stopped. We couldn't see inside. No lights came on, no windows rolled down. The engine stayed running. We both stared at it, unsure what to do. After about 5 minutes, the SUV turned around and drove back up the road, disappearing into the dark. That was the moment everything shifted. Neither of us said anything right away, but we both felt it. Something wasn't right. People don't just drive down to someone's isolated campsite in the dark, sit there for a few minutes, then leave. Not without saying anything. Not out here. We hadn't seen a ranger all day. We hadn't seen any other people at all. We were alone, and now we weren't. My husband looked at me and said, "Let's pack everything up. Now." He was already grabbing the cooler and folding up our chairs. I didn't ask questions. I tossed everything I could into the car while he kept the flashlight pointed toward the beach, sweeping it back and forth like he was expecting to catch someone moving. We both had this gut feeling, like maybe someone had been dropped off by that car and was hiding, watching us. I couldn't shake the image of someone crouched behind a tree or a rock, waiting for our fire to die down. We didn't fold anything neatly. We didn't try to organize. We threw our tent in the trunk half unzipped, grabbed our bags, and slammed everything shut. My husband kept the engine running and the headlights on full blast while I got in. As soon as I was in the passenger seat and my door was closed, he gunned it. Gravel sprayed out behind us as we tore up the narrow road. Not even 2 minutes later, I looked in the side mirror, and there they were. Same SUV, same blacked out windows, headlights off, only visible in our taillights. They'd waited until we were leaving. Then they came after us. My husband floored it. He looked over at me once and said, "I have to go fast. Are you okay with that?" I said, "Just go." The road was terrible, unpaved, full of potholes and sharp turns. Trees lined both sides, and sometimes deer or antelope would dart out of nowhere. But he didn't slow down. We were going 70, then 80, bouncing over ruts and dodging rocks. I kept looking back, heart racing, trying to see if they were getting closer. They didn't use their high beams. They didn't flash us. They didn't try to pass. They just stayed on us less than 100 feet back, for miles. The worst part was going through the canyon. The road there narrowed, flanked by steep cliffs on one side and drop-offs on the other. There were no lights, no rails, and sharp curves that felt like they came out of nowhere. If we had lost control or swerved too hard, we would have gone right off the edge. But they kept coming. For almost 10 minutes, we were chased through the Wyoming wilderness at high speed. Every turn felt like it could be the last. Every bump threatened to send us flying. But somehow, we stayed ahead. My husband knew how to handle the car, and after we exited the canyon, the road opened up again. We didn't see them after that. I don't know if they turned off or couldn't keep up, but eventually, their headlights disappeared completely. We didn't stop driving for over an hour. We kept going until we got back to the main highway, and even then we drove another 20 miles before pulling into a gas station that was still open. We parked right under the lights and just sat there. Both of us were shaking. I remember looking at his hands on the steering wheel. They were still gripping it like we were back on that dirt road. We didn't talk much after that. We got a motel room in town and didn't sleep that night. Every time a car passed by outside, we tensed up. Every sound made us flinch. That night broke something in both of us. Some quiet belief that the world, while not always kind, was at least predictable. We reported it to the local sheriff's office the next morning. We gave them a description of the SUV, the time, the place. They took our statement, said they'd look into it, but we never heard anything back. Nothing ever came of it. We still talk about that night sometimes, about what might have happened if we'd stayed put, about whether someone had been watching us from the trees, whether they were planning to wait until the fire burned out, until we were zipped up in our tent, unable to run. I think about how isolated that place was, how long it would have taken for someone to find us if something had gone wrong. I think about how important it is to trust your gut, even if nothing makes sense on paper. You don't need to know why something feels wrong. You just need to listen. We haven't gone camping since. Back in the fall of 2018, I was with a backpacking group doing a multi-day hike in North Carolina. It was one of those guided group treks where a couple of professionals lead a mix of people through trails and peaks over the span of a week. I remember the air being cool and crisp that morning, and the leaves were just past peak, littering the ground in reds, oranges, and dry brown. On the third day, we had made it up one of the Pilot Mountains, not the big one that everyone knows, but the smaller one nearby. I don't know why there are two called Pilot, but that's how it is. This one wasn't as tall, but the view was still amazing. You could see the valleys stretching out, with some low fog hanging along the tree line like a soft veil. We took photos, had some trail mix and protein bars, and just sat for a bit enjoying the breeze. We started heading back down around noon. The trail was narrow in parts, and it wasn't a straight drop, but it wound its way down with some steep switchbacks. I was near the middle of the group, moving steadily, when I felt a little off. At first I thought maybe I just stood up too fast or hadn't eaten enough. My head felt floaty, like I wasn't fully grounded. I paused for a second, told myself I'd be fine, then took a few more steps. That's when it hit me. Out of nowhere, the ground tilted, not like a stumble or a light head rush, but a full-on wave of vertigo. My legs gave out. I dropped right there on the trail. The spinning was unreal. My body wouldn't obey me, like my brain and limbs weren't in sync. The trees, the dirt, even the sky, it all twisted around me. Then came the nausea. I started throwing up hard, dry heaving when there was nothing left. I couldn't even sit up without the world turning sideways. It felt like someone had taken the inside of my head and scrambled it with a stick. People gathered around pretty quickly. Our lead guide, a guy who'd been with the group from the beginning, crouched down beside me. He kept calm, checked my pulse, tried to talk to me, though I couldn't really focus on words. Everything was foggy and distant. I remember someone putting a jacket over me. Someone else held a bottle of water to my lips, but I couldn't drink. The second it touched my tongue, my stomach twisted again and I puked into the dirt beside me. After a while, maybe an hour, the guide made the call to have the rest of the group keep going. He stayed behind with me, radioed for help. That trail wasn't exactly easy to access, and we were near the top. Even though we weren't at a crazy altitude, we were far enough into the woods that getting emergency help wasn't a simple task. The temperature started dropping fast. That afternoon had been in the 50s or 60s, but by late afternoon it was clear it would hit the teens after dark. I was already soaked in sweat from the nausea and shaking from the vertigo. I was still vomiting any time I tried to move, and I couldn't hold anything down. The EMT who reached us maybe an hour or two later, time was weird by then, took one look at me and started setting up in 4. The problem was the fluid going into me was cold, and my body wasn't doing a great job regulating temperature anymore. My fingers and lips felt stiff, and I remember how my skin tingled, like pins and needles crawling up my arms. The rescue team couldn't even reach us at first. The trail wasn't wide enough for a stretcher crew to navigate, so they were literally chainsawing through the brush to cut a new path toward us. I could hear the distant hum of chainsaws mixed in with the wind and the rustling of dry leaves. The sun started setting, and I remember watching the light fade through the trees above me, feeling my body get heavier and heavier. At some point, the EMT and the guide were murmuring to each other, quiet but serious. I couldn't hear all of it, but I caught the word helicopter. They didn't want to wait too long in case things got worse. I was half awake, drifting in and out, the kind of state where your thoughts don't feel like they belong to you. Every time I opened my eyes, the world shifted slightly, like I was on a boat. Finally, around 9 p.m., the rescue crew reached us. I don't know how many of them there were, maybe 6 or 8, but they worked fast. They wrapped me in a thermal blanket, strapped me into a stretcher, and lifted me like I weighed nothing. Moving made the nausea hit all over again, and I remember choking back bile while they carried me. Every jostle felt like my brain was shaking loose inside my skull. They carried me for what felt like forever. Then we reached a flat enough area where they could transfer me to an ATV. The noise was deafening after all the quiet in the woods, and the ride was rough. Every bump sent pain shooting through my head and stomach. I don't remember most of the trip down. I think I passed out for part of it. When we reached the ambulance, I was barely aware of anything. They loaded me in, covered me in more blankets, and the 4 kept going. The EMTs inside asked questions, name, age, symptoms, but my voice was too hoarse to answer more than a few words. I was freezing, soaked with sweat, dizzy beyond anything I'd ever felt in my life. At the hospital, they rushed me through tests. I remember the cold table under me during the CT scan, the smell of disinfectant in the ER room, the bright lights that felt like knives in my eyes. They checked to see if I was having a heart attack. They scanned my head for signs of a stroke. I was hooked up to monitors, wires taped to my chest, my arm full of 4 tubes. Everything came back clean. No heart attack, no stroke, nothing they could pin it on. I couldn't stand or walk. I still couldn't drink anything without getting sick. But they said since the tests were normal, there wasn't anything else to do. It was 3 a.m. when they released me. They wheeled me out into a cold, mostly empty lobby and offered to call me a cab. That was it. No shelter. No help finding somewhere to go. I didn't even know where we were. I was too out of it to look up a hotel, couldn't walk more than a few feet without support, and hadn't eaten or had real water in over 12 hours. I sat there, shivering and weak, staring at the sliding glass doors. The parking lot beyond them was pitch black except for a few flickering street lamps. I couldn't even sit up straight. I kept sliding down in the chair. My backpack had been sent ahead with the group, so I had nothing. No phone, no wallet, nothing but the thin hospital gown and a few blankets. And then, this is the part one still think about the most. A nurse walked by. I didn't call out to her. I didn't say anything. I just looked up when she passed, and I guess she saw something in my face. She paused, walked back, asked softly if I had anywhere to go. I shook my head. She didn't say much, just nodded once, turned, and came back with a wheelchair. She wheeled me quietly down a side hall and into an empty patient room. No one saw us. She tucked me into the bed, dimmed the lights, and brought me 2 small bottles of water and a couple of saltine crackers. I don't think I've ever tasted anything better in my life. She sat with me for a few minutes, checking my pulse again, then left. She came back later with another blanket and a small packet of peanut butter. I stayed there until morning. Around 8 a.m., someone from my group showed up at the hospital. They'd driven out as soon as they got word of where I'd ended up. When I stood up, I was shaky but finally able to walk. I leaned on them most of the way out. I never saw that nurse again. I don't know her name, but I remember her face. That trip could have ended differently. If I'd passed out in the cold, if the team hadn't reached me in time, if the guide hadn't made the call to stay back, if the EMT hadn't pushed for help fast, if that nurse hadn't cared enough to help when the system didn't. There were so many people who stepped up in the middle of a mess and saved my life. Even now, when I look back, the scariest part wasn't the physical stuff. It was the moment sitting in that hospital lobby, feeling completely abandoned, unsure if anyone was coming for me. That's what stuck. But they did come, every single one of them, and because of that, I made it home.